my God! Is this what they're using to grow my organic produce? This is the fourth in a series of videos comparing conventional and organic farming. The first video was a general overview, and the second compared farming techniques, and the last one compared manure use. So in this video, I'd like to talk about the two farming systems and their impacts on humans and other animals and the environment. This is a broad topic, so what I like to do first is focus in detail on the materials that are allowed for use in conventional and organic farming, and then in another video, talk about how these materials affect all of us. Because one primary difference between the two farming systems is the use of pesticides, let's talk about pesticides first. We need to start by understanding the USDA definition of the word pesticide. So most of us think that pesticides are things that kill critters like insects, but the USDA considers a pest to include things like insects, weeds, and things like fungus and bacteria. And so the word pesticide includes herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides, and also things like soil fumigants, plant growth regulators, defoliants, and desiccants. So the reason I'm even talking about this is because I've heard people say things like organic farming is worse for the environment than conventional farming. And there have been articles popping up every once in a while, like this one here, where he asks, do organic farms really produce chemical-free, healthier food? And here he explains how many organic approved pesticides pose significant environmental and human health risks. They include nicotine sulfate, which is highly toxic to warm-blooded animals, and copper sulfate, which is a widely used organic pesticide that persists in the soil. He goes on to say that more than 24 synthetic chemical pesticides are permitted in organic agriculture, and organic farmers are demanding more. As an example, he shows here that at the time of publication, about this time last year, the USDA was proposing to change restrictions on 17 substances allowed in organic production and handling, and that the changes up for public comment also add 16 substances to the national list. So that all sounds pretty awful, actually. To make sense of this, we need to look in detail at the materials that are allowed in organic farming. But in order to understand how use of these substances actually fits into the organic farming system, let's first take a look at this USDA guide for organic crop producers. Okay, so this section is about managing pests, weeds, and diseases. It says here that in order to successfully transition to an organic system, farmers should be willing to approach these challenges from a different perspective. Preventing severe pest outbreaks will allow a farmer to avoid broad-spectrum pesticides that will lead to future imbalances in the system. So what it's talking about here is, for example, if you're spraying to kill aphids on a crop, then you're also going to kill the ladybugs that eat the aphids. So in order to reach this balance, the USDA organic regulations require farmers to approach pest and disease problems using a three-tiered approach. Level A requires a system designed to actually prevent the pest and disease outbreaks, and these practices include things like crop rotation and providing habitat for natural predators. Now, if the practices in Level A are not sufficient, then Level B allows for mechanical or physical practices, such as something like covering crops with insect netting, things like that. And then if Level A and B practices have been tried and have not achieved success, then Level C practices allow for using biological and botanical substances to control pests. And there's also an option for using allowed synthetic substances. And even then, organic farmers can't just go, willy-nilly spraying crops if a problem comes up. Each year, as they prepare paperwork to renew organic certification, they have to list any materials that they plan to use based on experience from past years. And if during the growing season they need to use something that they haven't included in their plan, then they actually have to contact their certifier first to get approval. So anyway, let's take a look at this list of materials. Now first, it's important to understand that in the USDA organic program, synthetic substances are prohibited unless specifically allowed on the list. But non-synthetic or natural substances are all allowed unless specifically prohibited on the list. And this is because, in general, natural substances are, considered safe. But as we know, there are some natural materials that aren't safe, like arsenic, for example. It's natural, but we wouldn't want to be eating it. So, substances like arsenic are specifically listed as a prohibited material in organic farming. Now, we can talk more about some of the other natural substances that are listed as prohibited because that's really important. But let's first take a look at the list of synthetic substances that the USDA does allow in organic farming. So, this is the list of synthetic substances allowed in the organic program. But now remember, these substances are allowed not as a first or even a second option, but are allowed as a Tier C backup plan. So what I've got here is I've highlighted each section in red so that you can see the different categories. So for example, this section covers materials that are allowed as algicides, for killing algae, also disinfectants and sanitizers. So someone might say, man, can you believe they let organic farmers use chlorine materials and ozone gas? Well, yeah, but these are substances that, cities might use to disinfect drinking water. So if an organic farmer wants to sanitize sinks or clean out irrigation lines, then these substances are allowed. And so let's look at this copper sulfate in this section. It says it's allowed as an algicide in aquatic rice systems, limited to one application every 2 years, and it can't increase baseline soil test values for copper. Okay, so let's go on to look at the section on insecticides. So we have 10 substances allowed here. And you can kind of peruse these at your leisure later on if you'd like. The one that might interest people the most would be this use of copper sulfate. It can be used for tadpole shrimp control in aquatic rice production again, and with the same time period and soil test limit restrictions. So, yeah, there's that. And then, yeah, who knew you can kill rodents with vitamin D3? And okay, so I'm not going to be killing my slugs with ferric phosphate and elemental sulfur, but that is allowed. Okay, so let's look at plant disease control. This would be something like a bacterial blight or like a fungus that you might get in a crop. And we have 11 synthetic substances that are allowed for use in that situation. So looking here, we can see that copper compounds can be used for controlling plant diseases in a manner that minimizes accumulation in the soil. So except for controlling algae and tadpoles in rice fields, this would be the only allowed use for copper compounds, for controlling plant diseases. And then we can talk about which crops that might apply to a little later on. But that's what we've got. These are the synthetic materials that can be used for plant or soil amendments right here. Yeah, and then who knew that fish products and squid byproducts were synthetic? I guess it's what they're mixed with, like sulfuric and citric acid and stuff like that. And then we got microcrystalline cheese wax for use in log-grown mushroom production. So, yep, there we go. Last thing, let's take a look up here at herbicides. I wanted to save this one for last. Okay, so 2 synthetic materials are allowed: soap-based herbicides and mulches. But the soap-based herbicides aren't allowed on food crops, so that all that we're left with is mulches, and that can include sheets of like plastic ground cover. So, in other words, there are no synthetic herbicides that can be sprayed on organically grown food crops. Now, let's take a look at total herbicide use in United States agriculture. So, this is pounds of pesticides of active ingredients applied to major crops like corn, cotton, fall potatoes, soybean, and wheat. And we can see that herbicides make up the largest portion of pesticides used on these crops. And then looking at this other graph, which shows all pesticide use in agriculture, we can see that active ingredients of herbicides are highest, followed by soil fumigants, which are substances that are applied to soil to get rid of pests and diseases prior to planting crops. And neither of these things are used in organic agriculture. So maybe the author of that article was exaggerating just a bit when he said that many organic approved pesticides pose significant environmental and human health risks. He lists nicotine sulfate and copper sulfate as two examples, and we did see copper sulfate in the list of approved synthetic substances. But what about this nicotine sulfate stuff? And also, what about all those other chemicals that he said were going to be added to the list? The thing is, what he describes as organic farmers periodically whining to the USDA requesting new chemicals is actually part of a regular evaluation that the USDA is required to do. So, the USDA evaluates substances that are allowed or prohibited in organic farming. And the sunset provision requires that substances be reevaluated every 5 years to determine if use is still appropriate. And the USDA looks at any new information pertaining to the material's impact on human health and the environment, and its necessity due to the unavailability of wholly natural substances and its consistency with organic production and handling. So, in this 2019 Sunset Review and Substance Renewals, it says that things like chlorine materials used as sanitizers and disinfectants, and also copper compounds for use in managing crop disease, will continue to be allowed. But we see that two natural substances, lead salts and nicotine sulfate, continue to be listed as prohibited substances. So there you go. The rest of these substances are for livestock, and these are ingredients in organic food processing. So, why did this article say that nicotine sulfate is used in organic farming when it's actually listed as prohibited? And this is similar to another common confusion about a substance called rotenone. Rotenone it comes from a root of a plant that is found in Southeast Asia, South America, and East Africa, and it's a potent killer of fish. So it was actually used traditionally to go fishing. You just chuck it in the water and then you've got dinner. But it's also still approved for use today in the United States in situations like, killing off invasive fish in a lake. It's still allowed for that. And historically, it was used as a pesticide in the United States, but in 2004, the EPA required a neurotoxicity study on rotenone because there had been tests done on rats before and they had developed, like Parkinson like symptoms. But before that neurotoxicity study could actually happen, the three companies that had registered the product in the United States actually voluntarily requested that it be canceled, except for that use, the limited use of killing fish in a lake type thing. So, one confusing bit was that this document in 2007 says that rotenone is being re registered. So, it's like, what? They're going to let farmers use this stuff again? But no, actually, this was part of a reevaluation that the EPA was required to do on hundreds of old pesticides that, they wanted to look at new toxicity information that it might apply. And rotenone had been used as a pesticide starting just after World War II. So, here rotenone was being re registered, but not for use in crop agriculture. It's, again, just for that one purpose of use in killing fish. It can't be used in homes, it can't be used in agriculture. And so the other confusing thing was that although rotenone was no longer used for agriculture in the United States, it is a natural substance that could potentially be used where it's still available in other countries. So in 2012, the USDA National Organic Standards Board proposed adding it to the organic program's list of prohibited natural substances so that it would be clear that it isn't available to organic farmers in other countries. And it was eventually phased out, and that's documented in the final rule in January 2019. So it might be kind of confusing. I've been saying EPA, USDA, whatever. And, it's kind of like what government agency is responsible for doing what. So this is how that works. There are three federal agencies in the United States that share responsibility for the regulation and oversight of pesticide chemical residues in our food. So the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, registers or approves the use of pesticides and establishes tolerances for these pesticides. And what a tolerance is the maximum residue level of a specific pesticide chemical that is permitted in or on human and animal food. So then the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, is tasked with testing and enforcing these tolerances on food. And so they will take some foods every year and do tests on them to see what the levels are. And then the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or the USDA, is responsible for some foods, such as meat, poultry, catfish, and some egg products. But the USDA also does its own pesticide monitoring for conventional and organically grown foods. And also, the USDA is the one that oversees the organic program. So, no, neither rotenone nor nicotine sulfate are registered by the EPA for use in the United States as a pesticide. And both of these are listed as natural prohibited substances by the USDA in organic farming, whether it's in the United States or other countries participating in the USDA organic program. Now, copper sulfate, that's different. It is allowed in the United States and is registered for use as a pesticide by the EPA. And it's also allowed in the USDA organic program for Tier C use, as we talked about before. But because it's a metal compound, there's concern about accumulation in soil. And that's why the USDA has limitations set on how much can be used by organic farmers. There is definitely an interest in eventually removing copper compounds from the organic program. The difficulty is that there aren't alternatives right now to dealing with some plant diseases that might arise, especially for crops like fruit and nuts that, they grow on trees, and then also other perennials like berries, which you can't just move around in a crop rotation like you could with, something like lettuce. And we have to remember that conventional farmers also rely on these copper compounds along with the other pesticides available to them. But regardless, yeah, the use of copper compounds in organic farming needs to go at some point. It's just kind of ironic that as the organic sector is trying to find alternatives to the few synthetics that they do allow as last ditch options, conventional farmers don't have the same level of restriction on copper use, and so they can use that or any of the other 900 chemicals that are registered by the EPA for pesticide use in agriculture. But one thing that we haven't talked about yet, we talked about how in organic farming, most synthetic substances aren't allowed except for those few dozen materials that are listed, and that most natural substances are allowed. So, except for those few things that are prohibited, like arsenic. And we also talked about lead salts and nicotine sulfate and rotenone, for example. But otherwise, all other natural substances are allowed for Tier C use in the USDA organic program. And so you'll hear about organic farmers using things like bacillus thuringiensis, or BT, which is a naturally occurring soil microorganism that kills other critters. And also, you might hear about spinosad, which is kind of like this goo that another type of microorganism produces that kills other critters. And also, there's things like neem oil, which comes from the fruits and seeds of an evergreen tree, which is found in India, and that can be used as a pesticide. And so, there are those kinds of substances that organic farmers can use that you might hear about. And, of course, these things aren't something we should just dismiss. But I do think that we need to step back and look at the bigger picture and consider that the bulk of chemicals used in agriculture are coming from the conventional use of herbicides and fumigants that we looked at in those graphs earlier. So, in the next video, I'll talk about impacts of these substances on the environment and the effects on humans and other animals, and also talk about problems in agriculture other than the use of these chemicals, which are probably even more critical.